At the edge of the medieval world, where heat shimmered off the sand and the sea crashed against the coast, two titans of history moved toward each other like storm fronts destined to collide. Their armies were exhausted, wounded, and pushed to the breaking point, yet the fate of kingdoms, faiths, and generations still unborn hinged on the choices they would make in the days ahead. What unfolded was not merely a battle, but a test of willpower so extreme that chroniclers struggled to describe it without reaching for words like miracle or madness. Dawn crept over the Levant on September 7th, 1191, slicing through the haze, the grit, and the misery that wrapped around the crusader column like a curse. For 7 relentless days, they had pushed south, 12,000 hollow-eyed men staggering forward, their armor dragging behind them as if made of lead. Their lips were split open, their shields battered, their horses stumbling with every step. And all the while, Saladin's skirmishers had harassed them without mercy, arrow after arrow chipping away at their strength and their sanity. Yet on that brutal morning near Arsuf, these same burned-out soldiers were about to unleash a storm that would shake the medieval world to its core. 30,000 of Saladin's finest warriors waited for them. Veteran horsemen, elite Mamluks, seasoned archers who had shattered the Crusader kingdoms and carried the banner of Islam across Jerusalem for 4 triumphant years. Many believed these men untouchable, guarded by both momentum and the towering legend of Saladin himself. That illusion was about to die. The turning point didn't come over a long day of fighting. It erupted in just 17 blistering minutes. 17 minutes in which the Crusader line pushed beyond human limits, snapped into a fury so fierce that it carved through Saladin's army like a steel hurricane. Eyewitnesses described the charge as if a mountain had broken loose and collapsed upon the plain, lances splintering, hooves pounding like thunder, screams vanishing beneath the blazing noon sun. Even the air trembled with violence. When the dust finally cleared, 700 Crusaders lay dead, but the earth was covered with thousands of fallen Muslims. Chroniclers counted more than 7,000 bodies, a number so staggering that it overturned everything medieval commanders believed about war. Fast, agile cavalry was supposed to exhaust heavy knights, not be crushed beneath their charge. But Arsuf was no ordinary battle. To the men who fought that day, this wasn't simply a contest of strength. It was the hinge on which the entire Third Crusade turned. If Richard's knights shattered, Jerusalem was lost forever. If they held their ground and struck back, even for a moment, destiny itself might be rewritten. To understand how an army on the edge of collapse could suddenly strike like a bolt of lightning. To understand why Saladin's veterans, the same men who had broken the Crusaders at Hattin, suddenly turned and fled. We must return 1 week earlier, to the beginning of a deadly chess match between 2 of the greatest commanders of the Middle Ages. Back to the narrow coastal road where heat, hunger, and a constant storm of arrows set the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Before the sands of Arsuf were drenched in blood, the storm was already gathering, quietly, deliberately, in the shattered remains of Acre. The city had fallen only weeks before after a siege so savage that even hardened crusaders whispered about it at night. But from that devastation rose a singular figure, Richard I of England, the Lionheart. To the men marching behind him, he was more than a king. He was a force of nature, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, a ruler forged by betrayal, rebellion, and endless campaigns. At 33, he stood at the height of his power, a warrior king whose presence alone could steady trembling hands. Across the plains, watching each movement with surgical precision, stood Saladin, the Kurdish Sultan whose victories had remade the Middle East. His triumph at Hattin in 1187 had crushed the Crusader states, seized the true cross, and opened the gates of Jerusalem. For the Muslim world, Hattin proved the Franks could be broken. For the Crusaders, it remained an open wound. The two giants had never met in a true field battle, but everyone sensed it. The collision was inevitable. After Acre, Richard faced a decision that would define the entire campaign. He could march inland toward Jerusalem immediately, chasing glory, or he could secure the coastline first, ensuring supply ships could reach him safely. Most commanders would have chosen the Holy City. Richard chose the long game. He turned his army south toward Jaffa, staying close to the Mediterranean where his fleet shadowed him. But that coastal road was a death corridor, 80 miles wedged between the sea and the rising hills. To the west, open water. To the east, thick scrub and forested slopes perfect for ambush. The Crusaders would march in plain sight, exposed at every bend. Saladin recognized the opportunity instantly. This was the path he had dreamed of, the perfect trap prepared for years. Every hill, every twist, every shaded ravine favored his mounted archers and lightning-fast cavalry. Richard, he believed, wasn't exercising caution. He was marching straight into annihilation. But what made this campaign terrifying wasn't merely the terrain. It was the fact that both leaders had studied each other like predators circling in the dark. Richard analyzed every tactic Saladin had ever used. Saladin interrogated prisoners about how the Lionheart thought, how his knights charged, how his infantry held the line. Two doctrines, two worldviews, two tactical minds sharpened to a deadly edge. The march to Arsuf would reveal which one truly understood the art of war. The road from Acre to Jaffa should have been just another coastal march. Long, grueling, but nothing unusual for armies forged by siege and desert heat. Instead, it became the arena for one of the most unforgiving tactical strangulations in medieval history. As August melted into September, Saladin struck first. From the ridges and scrub-covered hills that towered over the thin coastal road, he called forth nearly 30,000 warriors, a living tempest gathering above the Crusader march. His army was not built for slow, grinding battles, nor for shield-to-shield slugging matches. It was crafted for movement, precision, and psychological destruction. At the core of this war machine stood the Mamluks. These men were sculpted from childhood into perfect soldiers, masters of horseback archery, whose reputation stretched across continents. Their composite bows could spit arrows so rapidly that the very air seemed to hiss. To Richard, they were like phantoms, close enough to kill, yet gone before a blade could reach them. And for a long, narrow, killing corridor like this coastal road, they were the ideal predators. But Richard did not flinch. He commanded fewer troops, only about 2,000 knights and 10,000 infantry, yet every one of them was trained to operate as a single, grinding engine of war. Western knights weren't built for elegance. They were built to break things, but breaking would have to wait, because if even one part of the formation snapped, the entire army could be swallowed whole. So Richard devised something brutally simple and terrifyingly effective: a moving fortress. Infantry lined the exposed flank, shields interlocked, spears jutting outward like the spines of a living beast. Crossbowmen moved within the protective shell, stepping out only when commanded. Cavalry stayed coiled inside the formation, lances lowered, forbidden to charge until Richard gave the only signal that mattered: 3 trumpet blasts. But discipline carried a bitter cost. The September sun did not merely burn, it punished. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Crusaders' armor became searing metal ovens. Sweat vanished before it touched their skin. Dust swirled around them in choking waves, kicked up by thousands of hooves. Every step wore down morale like sandpaper scraping bone. Water, their only salvation, had to be rationed drop by drop. And from dawn until dusk, Saladin's horse archers shadowed the column, dispensing death in a steady, merciless drizzle. Arrows hummed through the air, hammered into shields, tore through horses, thudded against helmets. The sound became a second heartbeat, constant, inescapable, maddening. Saladin didn't need a grand clash. He wanted Richard's army to roast, to bleed, to break. And with each passing hour, the trap drew tighter. The first arrows came lazily, almost playful, a casual whistle, a flicker of feathers, and a thud against a crusader shield. But within hours, that gentle probing turned into a relentless metal storm. Saladin's mounted archers shadowed the column like wolves, riding in close to taunt their prey, loosing volleys, then evaporating into the hills before a counterstrike could even be imagined. This wasn't mere combat. It was psychological surgery. All day the crusaders marched through a symphony of agony. Drums boomed like a colossal heartbeat across the hills. War cries echoed endlessly until even veteran knights felt their nerves unravel. And always, the arrows hissed through the blazing air. Richard's orders were absolute. No charges. No impulsive heroics. No breaking formation. Only when the Lionheart called for the 3 trumpet blasts could the knights be unleashed. For warriors raised to strike first and think later, this command felt like a betrayal of their very blood. These were men who lived for the thunder of hooves, the splintering of shields, the raw ecstasy of a charge. Yet now they were forced to watch comrades die, powerless to avenge them, forbidden even to move. By the second day, the suffering became unmistakable. Shields bristled with arrows. Horses collapsed mid-march. Men clenched their teeth as shafts punched through mail and into flesh. But still the formation did not crack. By the third day, the ground was carpeted with shattered arrow shafts. Chroniclers later claimed hundreds of thousands of arrows had rained upon the column. So many that the crusaders grimly joked they marched beneath a man-made storm cloud. Then came the first true rupture. A young knight, driven mad by heat and grief, spurred out of the formation. He didn't make it 20 yards. Mamluk riders descended on him like hawks, cutting him down before his brothers could even shout his name. His final scream rippled down the line like a warning delivered from beyond the grave. By the 5th and 6th days, the Crusader elite, Hospitallers at the front, Templars guarding the rear, were stretched to the breaking point. Their horses stumbled. Their shields bent inward. Their arms trembled from constant readiness. Yet somehow the line held. The army moved like a single wounded beast, refusing to die. And that was when Saladin realized something chilling. Richard wasn't breaking. He was tightening. By dawn on September 6th, the Sultan sensed the shift. Instead of collapsing under a week of punishment, the Crusader army had become taut as a drawn bowstring. Every hour they survived pushed them closer to the fortified safety of Arsuf. If he didn't crush them by the next day, he might lose his only chance. So Saladin made his decision. Tomorrow would be the killing stroke. That evening, Richard gathered his commanders beneath the flickering torchlight. Dust coated their faces like ash. Armor was dented and scorched. Their horses shook from exhaustion. Yet the Lionheart's voice cut through the camp like tempered steel. Saladin will commit everything tomorrow, he warned. He must before we reach the camp. Hold your lines. Hold your fury. We strike only when the moment is right. The knights needed no encouragement. Their bodies were battered, but their resolve had never been sharper. A week of torment had hardened them. The question now wasn't whether they wanted to charge. Their blood was boiling for it. The question was whether Richard could restrain them long enough for the perfect moment to arrive. And on September 7th, that moment would erupt out of a nightmare. As the Crusaders locked into their marching formation, the horizon suddenly exploded with motion. Saladin's entire host, tens of thousands strong, poured down from the hillsides. His cavalry wings spread outward like the gaping jaws of a hunting beast. The Mamluk center braced for a crushing advance, while reserve units hovered in the rear, ready to strike any gap that opened. The air vibrated beneath the thunder of war drums. At the head of the Crusader column, the Hospitallers braced themselves for impact, and the impact came like a hammer. Wave after wave of mounted archers slammed into their line. Shields rattled under the rain of arrows. Horses screamed as shafts pierced their legs and sides. Ancient knightly brotherhoods, with histories stretching back centuries, were being picked apart one man at a time. Still no trumpet. Still no permission to charge. The Hospitaller Marshal watched his brothers fall. Men who had endured sieges, plagues, and horrors for decades, suddenly collapsing on a sand stained red beneath their armor. Through the narrow slit of his helmet, he could hear their voices, ragged with fury and desperation. "Let us strike. Order it. Marshal. End this torture." After 7 days of swallowing rage, something inside him snapped. In one explosive moment, he leveled his lance, kicked his heels into his horse, and shouted the words Richard had prayed never to hear. "Hospitallers ride." 300 knights surged forward in a wild, unauthorized charge. It was the nightmare Richard feared, and the opportunity he had been waiting for. For the briefest heartbeat, Richard the Lionheart watched the impossible unfold. 300 Hospitallers tearing out of formation like a black comet, cloaks snapping, lances angled toward the enemy. Discipline had cracked. Emotion had overtaken strategy. One wrong choice, 1 second of hesitation, and the entire crusader line could collapse like a punctured dam. If he tried to recall them, they'd be butchered. If he froze, the whole army might tear itself apart. So Richard chose the one path no chronicler would ever forget. He transformed disaster into destiny. The Lionheart rose high in his stirrups, lifted his sword toward the sky, and roared. "Sound the trumpets." Across the battlefield came the signal every knight had dreamed of, prayed for, and clenched their teeth waiting to hear. 3 long, piercing blasts, rolling over the hills like the voice of judgment itself. The effect was instantaneous. Nearly 2,000 armored warhorses lunged forward as one. Knights who had endured a week of heat, humiliation, and relentless arrow fire released all the fury they had buried inside. Rage became momentum. Momentum became fear. Fear became a weapon. And yet, even in their fury, they held formation with the precision of master soldiers. The Hospitallers, already in motion, carved open the right flank. The Templars, cold and disciplined, thundered ahead on the left. And in the center, beneath a whipping red and gold banner, Richard led his household knights in an unstoppable wedge of steel and wrath. Across the plain, Saladin's mounted archers transformed from hunters into prey. For a week, they had fired on the crusaders with impunity, always escaping before knights could close the distance. But now they saw an iron wall of lances hurtling toward them with the fury of a falling star. The collision wasn't simply a clash of armies. It was pure physics, mass, and violence fused into a single catastrophic moment. A warhorse at full charge hit with the impact of a modern car crash. Lances shattered like dry twigs. Men were hurled from saddles as though swept up by invisible hands. Horses screamed, armor buckled, bones snapped, and the crusaders still didn't slow. Swords flashed, maces caved in helmets. Warhorses, trained for battlefield savagery, kicked and trampled fleeing riders. Saladin's front ranks didn't just retreat. They disintegrated. The 7 days of torment were over. Now came the reckoning. The moment the Hospitallers ripped open the right flank, the entire battle transformed. What had been a suffocating stalemate erupted into a shockwave of annihilation. Richard's central wedge, knights roaring behind their visors, horses frothing at the mouth, slammed into the heart of the Mamluk formation like a colossal spear hurled by a titan. Chroniclers later wrote that Richard himself rode in the very front, his sword rising and falling, his shield warped from blows, his personal knights forming an unbreakable core around him. Wherever the Lionheart charged, men died. His presence alone seemed to slice open the enemy ranks. On the left, the Templars spotted their opening. With brutal precision, they shifted angle and crushed the exposed side of the Muslim line just as it began to buckle. The result was catastrophic. Hospitallers smashed the right. Templars collapsed the left. Richard's household knights drilled straight through the center. It was a true hammer and anvil moment. Except here, the anvil was living men, and the hammer was thousands of pounds of armored fury. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Soldiers who had once sworn Saladin was invincible now watched their elite regiments crumble. Officers screamed orders that vanished beneath the roar of hooves. Units dissolved into terrified clusters, trampling one another in their desperation to flee. Even Saladin's personal guard, the legendary final defense, buckled. Crusader wedges drove so deep into the Muslim lines that the Sultan's own men formed a moving shield around him, dragging him away as his banner toppled to the ground and was abandoned. From the first impact to the final collapse, only 17 minutes had passed. 17 minutes to unravel years of victories. 17 minutes to tear apart the myth of an unbeatable army. 17 minutes to shatter Saladin's confidence. What followed wasn't a pursuit. It was a slaughter. Crusader knights chased fleeing riders for miles until their horses nearly collapsed beneath them. Crossbowmen shot down stragglers across the plains. Every few steps, another body fell into the dust. When the dust finally began to settle, the killing field lay eerily silent except for the groans of the dying. Thousands of Muslim bodies blanketed the earth. The finest cavalry Saladin had ever commanded, gone in less time than it takes to recite morning prayers. The Sultan had not simply lost a battle. He had lost the spine of his army. When the final arrows stopped falling over the plains near Arsuf, even the air seemed stunned. The Crusaders, battered and bloodied, counted roughly 700 dead across the entire week's ordeal, most from the endless arrow fire and heat, not from the decisive charge. On the Muslim side, the cost was devastating. Chroniclers wrote of 5,000 to 7,000 dead, many elite riders, veteran commanders, and household warriors. High-ranking emirs lay scattered among shattered shields and riderless horses. To medieval eyes, the imbalance of casualties felt unnatural, almost divine, as if heaven itself had chosen a side. One might expect Richard, triumph scorching through his veins, to chase Saladin into the desert and finish him. Many of his knights begged him to do so. They wanted to push inland, strike the broken army, and march straight on Jerusalem. But Richard the Lionheart was not governed by adrenaline. He did something almost no commander of his age would have had the discipline to do. He called his men back. The cavalry reformed. The wounded were lifted to the rear. Horses were watered. Crossbowmen gathered bolts from the dead. Richard refused to let victory mutate into disaster. The same iron will that held the army from charging too early now held them from charging too far. The psychological shockwaves spread across the region like cracks through ancient stone. Saladin, conqueror of Hattin, liberator of Jerusalem, hero of Islam, had been driven from the field in under 20 minutes. Garrisons that once placed absolute faith in his invincibility began to falter. Cities like Jaffa and later Ascalon reconsidered their loyalties. Negotiations once unthinkable suddenly became practical. Saladin understood the message clearly. Meeting Richard in open battle again might destroy him. But the legacy of Arsuf reached beyond any treaty or fortress. It reshaped the very principles of medieval warfare. It proved that disciplined heavy cavalry, held in reserve and unleashed at the perfect moment, remained the most devastating force on earth. And it reminded the world that endurance, not aggression, had won the day. At Arsuf, Richard didn't simply defeat an army. He shattered a legend and rewrote the balance of the Holy Land in 17 unforgettable minutes.